Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of Joe Patrick on Football, where today we'll be talking a little bit about what has been said up at Flowery Branch this week following the Falcons' Week 1 loss to Tampa Bay and heading into a really important game now that you lose the opener, the home opener, a really important game on Sunday Night Football in Week 2 where you go on the road for the first time into a really loud environment, one of the craziest environments that exists in the NFL right now in Minnesota against the Vikings, which is a very interesting matchup. We'll be breaking down that matchup for both the offense and the defense and what we can anticipate the challenges for them being when they go up there Sunday night. But first, I do want to just get into a little bit of a mini topic before we start breaking the game down, which is about the pistol. And this was a topic of conversation yesterday, basically brought upon by the fact that the Falcons were the league, not just the league leaders in pistol usage through week 1, but by a vast margin. I think the Falcons were in pistol, I think about 40% of the time. And I think the next closest team was in pistol like 20% of the time. And then it's a sharp drop off. So the Falcons clearly believe in it. It's not a surprise, if you've been following this team since Zach Robinson came to be the offensive coordinator with Kirk Cousins last year. It's something that they really believe in. And we'll talk a little bit about why they believe in it, why they think it's good, why Zach Robinson, I guess specifically, thinks it's good and optimal in some respects, and then what, in my opinion, are some of the downsides of it. And it's just interesting. And I do want to just say off the bat that the Falcons are basically in pistol or shotgun pretty much every snap. And I've heard it referred to, I can't remember if it's Zach who said this before or maybe one of the other coaches or the players, but I've definitely heard it referred to as a pistol offense. Like this is a pistol scheme that they run. So I would not anticipate this changing much. Like I do think, and Zach Robinson said yesterday, that there are, opportunities and game plans for them to get under center a little bit more than they did. I think they were only under center like one or two plays in the game week 1, and I believe one of them was, interestingly, they got under center and then kind of ran the ball to the outside with Bijan Robinson on one of those goal line situations that was then stuffed for like a 3-yard loss on an early down. And we'll kind of talk about maybe some of the reasons why they have not been getting under center and maybe why they should be getting under center, and that could potentially help them in some of these short yardage situations. But, what's interesting is, the reasons I've heard Zach talk before about, why the pistol is good is for just the general reasons why getting in the shotgun is good. For the quarterback, there's less footwork involved in terms of them having to, do a deep drop from under center. And obviously when you had Kirk Cousins and the Achilles/ankle injury that he was dealing with last year, it obviously made a lot of sense for him to be in a more natural position, just physically, like more situated closer to where his launch target would be, or his launch point would be from the pocket. And so that's kind of the main reason why I had heard that it's useful. And also when you're back like that in that, shotgun, you can call it, I'm going to, by the way, kind of conflate shotgun with pistol. There is maybe a slight difference in terms of, where the quarterback is in that setup, but we're talking about the same thing, which is basically a snap that has to travel some distance to get to the quarterback. And when you're in that position as a quarterback, you also have quicker and easier access to some of the RPO throws that you need to make. If you're just literally trying to get the ball and get it out of your hand on like a bubble screen as fast as possible, basically an extension of the run game, you just have a better angle to make that pass when the ball is snapped back to you a little bit and you have a couple yards, as opposed to, just being right under center and doing that. That's why you don't really see a lot of that quick game stuff happen from under center as much. One of the other things, and I was talking to Dave Archer, who covers or calls the games for the Falcons, is the color commentator for the Atlanta Falcons radio network, which you can hear on 92.9 The Game, company man. Is that it's better for the running backs and their tracking when they're able to basically get the ball in their hands earlier, when you don't have that time delay of the quarterback having to travel from under center to make that handoff. So it helps the running backs to that extent, in his opinion. But I think that leads into one of the cons is that you just don't get as hard of an action in the play action game, because it's just there's more for linebackers to latch onto when they see that quarterback going from under center and going to give that handoff to the running back. That's going to draw them in more than just a quick, like a quick turn and fake handoff. They can kind of more easily recover in that sense. And so you just don't get as hard of an action when you're in that pistol set. But I thought the interesting point that Zach brought up, and it made me think of something else, but he was talking about the motions and how many more motions you're able to execute out of the pistol because of literally the physical distance that you have between the center and the quarterback allows for tight ends, receivers, whoever, to be able to run, in between that gap, which can happen right at the snap, basically. So as long as it's literally not right at the snap and it's hitting that person in motion, like it did week 1 last year with Charlie Warner and a fumbled snap that occurred with Kirk Cousins that was featured on the Netflix show. But you can run, you can do jet sweeps in that sense, and get the ball out that way. Obviously something that Dwayne Ledford / Zach Robinson, not sure exactly who kind of thought up this scheme, but doing that insert blocking, whether that's with Charlie Warner or whoever, kind of able to come up into the line and help lead up in there or seal on the backside. There's just a lot more you can do with the motions. And speaking of that quarterbacks documentary or TV show. I always call it a documentary. It's really not a documentary. It's way too overproduced to be a documentary. But it's a TV show. But what we did hear from Kirk Cousins was just the amount of emotions that Zach Robinson has in this offense, and you see it. I mean, you see all kinds of different stuff. Whether it is the insert, the motions for those insert blocks, whether it's the sail motions for receivers to come into the backfield and then run their routes from out of the backfield. We see, or coming out of the backfield and going out into like a wider area. There's just so much that Zach Robinson likes to play with in terms of the motions. And I think the way that he sees it, the way he was describing yesterday, is just you just have more. You can do more in that sense. When you have that gap between the center and the quarterback for players to be motioning into. So that's interesting. But I actually thought that made me think of one of the keys for the Falcons and what they've implemented under Zach Robinson in the pass protection game. We saw this again in week 1 and we saw it last year, and I haven't really noticed a lot of other teams doing this. I'd be curious to know how prevalent it is across the NFL or even in college potentially, but there's something the Falcons will do when they get the double mugged look, that mugged up look where you have linebackers or stand-up guys in those A gaps and you've got all the kind of gaps filled between the offensive linemen, and there's some uncertainty into how they're going to be able to protect the quarterback in those situations. You will see a shift where Bijan Robinson or whoever's in the backfield will literally like shift up and stand like a yard behind the guard, like literally like right behind the offensive line to be ready to protect against those mugged looks in case both of those backers do come, and that way the Falcons can better protect. That's just the way that they structure their protections. And I don't know if it would work if you were under center and you were in that double mugged up look. I don't know if you could actually bring if you brought Bijan Robinson up into that same position that he's filling now in those protections, he would literally be standing like shoulder to shoulder with the quarterback who's taking the snap. And that creates obviously clutter that you don't want to have to deal with. So when you talk about the motions, you talk about the running back tracking, the RPO access, and then I think importantly that pass protection and the way that the Falcons like to scheme up their protection. I think that all leads into the reasons why they like the pistol set and the shotgun set. And I know the Commanders were another team in week 1 that took 100% of their snaps, so even more technically than the Falcons, at least out of a gun. They were not in pistol. I don't know. I don't know how much they were in pistol, but I know that they took 0 under center snaps. The Eagles were a team that also obviously takes very few under center snaps, and they like to do a lot of that quick game as well. I think there were about a handful of teams that were like, you can just see by the snap counts, it's very predominantly a shotgun/pistol style offense, but obviously, as we said off the top, there's nobody that's doing pistol more than Zach Robinson and the Falcons, which makes them an outlier in that sense. And then I think one of the other detractions And I'm going to try to ask more people about this. It's less for a conversation that happens on record because I don't know how honest I'll get on record, and I don't even know if I want to ask the Falcons coaches about it as much as just other football people who would have an idea of this. But my sense is that the pistol and shotgun snaps hurt this team in short yardage because, especially when you're trying to run up the middle, which they were trying to do in a lot of those short yardage situations, whether it was 4th and goal or on the goal line, because the center, when the center is making a snap like that, which is not with the quarterback's hands on your ass, but having a little bit further back, you kind of have to be a little bit like rocked back in your stance a bit. You can't be like firing out. If you're if the center is firing out too hard, that there's much more of a likelihood that you're going to see that snap go over the quarterback's head or just generally be inaccurate. But the general sense is because of the way that the leverage is angled, if that center is trying to get low and get penetration and move off the snap as fast as possible, it creates an angle where the ball is going to kind of shoot up behind him. I know because I played center in high school and I had this issue, especially at the beginning. So it took a while to kind of get my snaps under control. And I think it's one of the reasons why. I mean, we've seen Falcons centers in the past, Drew Dahlman, obviously, have some issues in this respect. So, and we saw it, remember last year against the Commanders, there was that snap that put them in a hole where I think most of us thought they'd lost the game at that point, where they were on the goal line, again, trying to, I think, do a direct snap to Bijan Robinson and have some of that power blocking up front, and the snap goes over his head or is inaccurate, and he has to track back 10, 15 yards, 20 yards, however long it was, and that set them back. Ultimately, Michael Penix was able to pull off some magic and get them out of that situation, but I think that's a perfect example of how the pistol snaps can go wrong in those instances. And I think that, and again, I would just say, why not just get under center in those instances? If they're capable of it, as Zach Robinson has said, and he did say, we can get under center if we want, why not get under center in some of those instances? Maybe it's because he feels like it's predictable. I know that's also one of the reasons he likes pistol, is because you can get, it's harder to nail down your tendencies when you're in pistol as opposed to in a traditional shotgun. And maybe he feels like if he's getting under center in a short yardage, it's very predictable that they would be trying to, run the ball, and maybe more specifically run the ball, in the interior. But I feel like that's pretty predictable anyway for defenses when you're in a fourth and short, or when you're in those short yarded situations. And I think I'm preaching to the choir of you guys listening, saying that you would like to see a little bit more under center, but who knows? We'll see. But it's something definitely to keep tabs on. We'll continue to watch it as we get into week 2 of NFL action, where the Falcons will be on primetime television for the first time this year. I believe they have 6 games that are going to be at least nationally televised, and if not in prime time. And this will be the first one heading up north to the Great White North to play the Minnesota Vikings. And the Falcons did get some good news on the injury front. Wednesday, Drake London did practice in a limited capacity after missing the end of the game with a shoulder injury. Saw him out there. He looked, decent enough to me. There was a couple videos you can see on my X account, which is JPatrick200, where he's running through some bags. That was pre-practice, and then once they get into a little bit of individual, you could see him catching a football, and he raises his hands up above his head to grab that particular catch. So that's good to see, considering he has a shoulder. And Darnell Mooney continues to practice. He was again limited on Wednesday, but as I've continued to say, he looks good running, and I guess that's what you would expect. It's a shoulder injury that he's also dealing with, and it sounded like he was, touch and go, and was a game time decision. We saw him warming up ahead of the game week 1, and it just feels to me like it's a contact situation, and as soon as he's cleared for contact, he's going to be ready to play. And what we've heard from the coaches is that basically, if he's cleared, he's going to be full go and ready to go. And the Darnell Mooney, I think that most of us expect, and I think that they could really use him, honestly. And it's not to besmirch Casey Washington. I thought he played fine. Thought he made a couple nice catches in that game, some kind of tougher catches that he was able to catch cleanly. But Darnell Mooney is Darnell Mooney for a reason. He's has a great understanding of football. I love Zach. He just says, the guy just gets football. He just gets it. You don't have to kind of explain too much to him about why he's doing the things that he does. And Kirk Cousins said it was the first one to kind of wax eloquently about Mooney's cerebral nature that he has and the way that he approaches what Kirk Cousins said, very much like a quarterback, and kind of even challenge Cousins in terms of just thinking deeply about certain concepts and things and how he wants to maneuver about the field. So I would say that the arrow is pointing up on both of those guys relative to maybe what we expected coming into this week, given their different situations. Now let's get into some of the matchups. I think it's a fascinating game between this Falcons and Vikings, not just because it's an important game for the Falcons, but you've got the Falcons going on the road for the first time this season, and when we talk about this team offensively, going into a very loud environment, and that's always a challenge, I think, going into those environments where you got to have your communication on point. You got to be really on the same page with your teammates, whether that's the offensive linemen with each other, whether that's Penix with his receivers, whether that's Penix with his offensive linemen and the protections and the backs, like we talked about earlier. You got to be able to kind of do that stuff all without really being able to talk, to be or being able to yell and understand that they won't not be able to hear you in that environment. And then so you take that challenge, and it gets compounded by the fact that you're going up against a scheme in Brian Flores, this is what I was asking about on Wednesday, who is going to make things as challenging as possible in that respect for Michael Penix to be able to understand what he's seeing on the field. Because Brian Flores is a very unique defensive play caller in this league. He goes to the very extremes of what defenses can do, and he is very willing to call those extreme defenses, whether that is a ton of cover zero, like going way above and beyond what a typical defensive coordinator might call in terms of the cover zeros or the extreme blitzes, and vice versa. He will be more willing to drop everybody into coverage than what we've seen. And what I remember, I have less of an idea on last year because it was on the road, but when we were able to see the Falcons play the Vikings at home in 2023, what I saw from the press box with that view was the Vikings really crowding the line, but then dropping off, and they were really dropping off in coverage, and they were going to say, we're going to make, I believe, was it Desmond Ridder at the time? I can't remember if it was Ridder or Heineke playing in that game. Maybe both. May have been Heineke, I'm not sure, but they were going to make them beat them, and they couldn't. The Vikings won that game miraculously, and we'll get into that later with Kevin O'Connell and the job that he can do calling a game no matter who his quarterback is, because I think he went through 3 of them in that game. But yeah, it's going to be a very difficult challenge for Michael Penix specifically for this reason, with not being able to, when you talk about not being able to communicate well, you have to just go into it understanding that's not going to be possible in that environment, on top of the way that Brian Flores is going to make for a very messy picture for the quarterback to try and decipher what is going on. And I would say the good news for Penix and what he showed week 1 is that he was one of the best quarterbacks in the NFL dealing under pressure, especially when he was under quick pressures. I think he was the best in the NFL with his EPA, the expected points added per play on those dropbacks. Very, very good, and great to see, especially for a quarterback like Penix, where there was some question marks, I guess, from some of the national media. I've always kind of been more sold on his ability to pass accurately in some of those quick situations where, interestingly enough, Penix was 0 for 7 down the field. At least that's the stat that I saw, 0 for 7 on passes on targets over 15 yards down the field. They just really weren't able to exploit any of those areas. But underneath, he was obviously very good, as his stats in that game would indicate. And so, considering he was so good under pressure, I have to think that if I'm to predict the way this is going to go, I would think that Flores is going to do something similar to what we described earlier in 2023, where I think he's going to try to make it a messy picture, force the Falcons to get into some of those pass protection situations where they have to shift Bijan Robinson up to protect against the potential double A-gap blitzing that they tend to like to do, but then to not do that, to then drop out of that, buzz out of those coverage, those looks, and then you kind of if the Falcons do have to move Bijan or Tyler, just the running back in general in that pass protection set, that basically creates an empty look, and you do wonder how the Falcons will deal with that. Maybe they do have some RPOs set up for some of those situations. But if I had to guess, I think that Flores is going to play more coverage than blitz, and we'll see how they deal with it. It's worth noting that this offensive line, when we talk about the run game for the Falcons offense, they all know it. The whole building knows it. That was kind of the conversation that was happening on Wednesday, was that they know they've got to be better in those situations, in being able to run the ball and move the ball on the ground. This team has been a team that runs to set up the pass, if you want to borrow that phrase, kind of take that idea. But it wasn't that ultimately by the end of week one, and we'll see if they can run the ball better. And it's going to be a difficult task, with the Vikings have really you revamp this front with Jonathan Allen, Javon Hargrave coming into the middle there. Those are two really, really, good defensive tackles in this league. The Vikings have tons of injuries. I'm not going through all of them because it's such a messy situation right now. It's not really worth kind of getting into trying to decide who would play, who would not. But it does sound like they could, if they're going to miss players, they could be lighter on the edges. But on the interior, they are still expected to be quite strong. So it'll be interesting to see how the Falcons' offensive line is able to deal with that. It should be very interesting for the team. Let's get into the Falcons' defense versus this Minnesota Vikings offense, where J.J. McCarthy was named the NFC Offensive Player of the Week for Week 1, despite, I think he threw for like 143 yards. He had 3 touchdowns. He had 2 passing touchdowns and a rushing touchdown, which, if you're looking at it statistically, I guess that's the reason why they gave it to him, as well as, the Vikings coming back from behind to win that game. But I was not impressed. I've never been impressed with J.J. McCarthy. It could be the Ohio State fan in me talking, as you can see behind me, and J.J. McCarthy is, of course, a Michigan guy, but just not impressed. And I think that what we talked about on the other side of the ball, that Brian Flores is probably going to drop into coverage against this Falcons offense. I would expect this Falcons defense to probably have a very similar kind of mentality going into this, where I feel like if you're going to lose it, let J.J. McCarthy beat you with his arm. Like, you cannot let him scramble, which obviously he did to success in that fourth quarter against the Bears on Monday Night Football. And that Kevin O'Connell can scheme some things up. I personally think he's the best play caller in the NFL. And he's shown it against the Falcons in particular, when he won with Josh Dobbs, who had joined the team like 3 days earlier. And I'm sure you guys will remember, if you were familiar with that game, him literally coaching him up on the sidelines between drives, telling him in his headset like where to go with the ball, based on the way that Kevin O'Connell was seeing the Falcons defensive line. It was a masterclass in coaching and being able to get the most out of your offense with a very limited quarterback at that point in time. J.J. McCarthy will be more functional than Josh Dobbs was then, but I'm still not so sure that he's great. Like, he's going to be very highly functional for this Vikings offense. And I think that there's an opportunity for the Falcons to bait him into some bad throws. And we saw this Falcons secondary and linebacking core getting their hands on footballs. Raheem Morris said earlier in the week that he counted 5 missed interceptions for the Falcons against Baker Mayfield and the Buccaneers in week 1, where they ultimately didn't have any turnovers. And I think that this is an opportunity for them to have some of those plays and to really kind of swing the game potentially in some of those moments, and maybe not make the life so stressful on Michael Penix and this Falcons offense if they're able to give them some extra possessions, an extra possession or two. But in order to be able to do that effectively, they're going to need to be able to get home with 4 rushers. That's going to be a key. We'll get into that a little bit later. But also, it's worth noting for this Minnesota offense going up against this Falcons defense, no Jordan Addison, still suspended, obviously. And they couldn't be without Christian Darrisaw, who is one of the best left tackles in the league. And that would be very fortunate for the Falcons if they've been able to miss both Tristan Wirfs in week 1 and Christian Darrisaw in week 2. Those are 2 of the best tackles in the NFL, and for both of them to potentially just be missing for whatever reason due to injury could be huge for them. So we'll see. It obviously will be a game that will be, not stress, but I think, we'll really kind of give James Pierce Jr., Jalen Walker, on top of Arnold Ebiketie and Leonard Floyd, the potential to show their worth and their value and be able to get home, because I do think getting into the keys to this game, I think one of them is, you got to get home with four. And that's not necessarily to say that you have to create quick pressures with four, but when you're dropping into coverage, I think that there's the possibility, a great possibility, that JJ McCarthy drops back, and with so many guys in coverage, he starts patting the ball. He starts, thinking twice about where he's going to go with it. And then you allow yourself time to ultimately collapse that pocket and get home against him. And one of the criticisms I had of the team and their pass rush in week one against the Buccaneers was that it felt like they were selling out a little bit too quickly to try to get to Baker. And that selling out was what allowed him to escape the pocket too many times and pick up yards with his legs, which I think we can expect J.J. McCarthy to want to do. I think when you look at J.J. McCarthy and what he is at this point in time, he's going to want to help move this team down the field with his legs, and create those opportunities for himself, even on design passes, even if it's not the read option stuff that we saw schemed up for him that Kevin O'Connell, again, called brilliantly in that fourth quarter that allowed him to score on. But J.J. McCarthy, he is very mobile, and the Falcons have to be wary of that. If J.J. McCarthy, rushes for 50 yards in this game, the Falcons are probably not winning it. If he's continually, doing what Baker Mayfield did week one, not necessarily long carries that are picking up substantial yards, but if he's picking up key first downs in certain instances to move them into field goal range or whatever it is, that could be brutal for this Falcons team, and that's a way that they could lose. And so I think that if they're just a little bit more patient, and just maintain their rush lanes and just kind of, I think with a young quarterback, you can kind of expect he's going to run into some sacks, honestly, as long as the coverage is somewhat solid. But, that coverage is a huge issue, and that's another key for this team, is to not let Justin Jefferson beat you. And I think that's what a lot of Falcons fans are going to have on their minds coming out of the game last year, where you saw just some really embarrassing looking performances in that respect. We saw D. Alford kind of get turned around and fall down. That was one that was a highlight reel or a low light reel, depending on your perspective, type of play. You can't be having any of that. I think we did see good signs, though, from, Xavier Watts. Raheem Morris couldn't not really be too much higher on a player, I think, coming out of that week one game. And obviously he got his hands on a couple footballs. Maybe the only way he could have been higher is if he actually comes down with a couple of those interceptions. But really promising from him, and hopefully that leads to not just stability, but some playmaking ability, more playmaking ability than they've had at that safety position when you already have a player like Jesse Bates. And it's interesting because Jesse, I think he'll probably talk about it on Thursday, but maybe just got overeager at times against Tampa Bay, and we talked about it a little bit on the podcast too. But you got to just play assignment football, disciplined football against this group of wideouts, and especially Justin Jefferson. And if you can keep him under control, and guys like T.J. Hawkinson, and you got to also watch out for Aaron Jones coming out of the backfield, where he proved himself to be a receiving weapon once again in week one. But you feel like, I think if you're the Falcons, you feel like you have the players on the defensive side of the football necessary to deal with those players, like a Divine Diablo. I think you feel very comfortable with him being able to run with Aaron Jones in particular, or a TJ Hawkinson in coverage. So will be an interesting matchup. And I would just say, the other key, and this is kind of lame, it's one you hear all the time, but the Falcons just have to play clean on offense and not turn the ball over. I feel like the only thing that can really kill them, not the only thing, but the main killer for them is going to be falling into the traps that Brian Flores is going to surely try to set for them. And whether that is setting a trap by showing a heavy blitz and then dropping out into it, and throwing to the wrong hot read or whatever it might be, you just cannot have any of those simple mistakes. As long as they don't do that, I have faith that this Falcons offense is going to be able to create enough against, again, in this game where I don't think they're going to need to score a million points in this game to win. I expect it to be a lower scoring affair with an offense on the other side in the Vikings that still has a very young green quarterback under center. And so it's going to be very interesting to see how it plays out, because it feels like it's one that's hanging on a knife's edge. I know that the Vikings are favored by 3.5 in this one, I believe, which, at home, that means, I guess these teams are roughly seen as even, but I think that's a favorable line for the Falcons, if I'm not going to lie. So it should be an interesting game. Again, you can keep following me for updates for what's going on at Flower Branch or my thoughts during the game. I'm at JAPatrick200 on X. I would strongly recommend you also follow 92.9 The Game on YouTube, or subscribe on YouTube to 92.9 The Game, which is where you can see this if you are listening to it on podcast. If you are watching this on YouTube, thank you very much. Click the like button if you enjoyed it, and subscribe if you're not. And you can follow the podcast on audio form at or just search Joe Patrick on football wherever you get your podcasts, and we'll pop up for you. I'll be back on the air on 92.9 The Game Sunday at 4 p.m. Not the normal time. Normally we're in the mornings, but obviously this is a prime time game. So I'll be on with Andy Bunker from 4 to 6 from our Midtown studios as the team is on the road, leading into the pregame show with Grant McCauley and Mike Johnson. That leads into kickoff, where you can hear Dave Archer and Wes Durham on the call on the Atlanta Falcons radio network, followed by the postgame show with Mike and Grant, and then Chris Thomas has you for the call-in show, the Falcons Flyover. So another full day of football. It's great that football's back, even though it didn't go as we wanted week one. Should be a very interesting matchup between the Falcons and Vikings in week 2, and what's a very important game for the Falcons. So we'll talk about it more on Sunday. We'll see you then.